Hello and welcome to the fourth class of our course on Descriptive Data Analysis. In this course, we are going to study variability or dispersion measures. The variability or dispersion measures provide a way of calculating the spread of the data, that is, the extent to which the values are spread out from the average. There are different measures of variability, including the range, the interquartile range, semi-interquartile range, variance, standard deviation, and the variation coefficient. We are going to study all of them in this class. Let's start with the mathematical description of each of the variability measures, and then we illustrate with an example. The range is simply the difference between the maximal value and the minimal value. The interquartile range is a measure of the spread of the center half of the distribution, and it is calculated by subtracting the third quartile by the first quartile. And the quartiles can be obtained by ordering all the values in the variable and dividing it in 4 parts. This means that the first quartile is going to have 25% of the ordered values, the second quartile is going to have 50% of the ordered objects, and the third quartile is going to have 75% of the ordered objects. The semi-interquartile range is the interquartile range divided by 2. The variance measures the distance between each value and the average, and this is a way of determining how spread is the distribution of values in relation to its average. The standard deviation is the square root of the variance, and the coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the average. It's usually presented in a percentage form. To illustrate, let's take the same example that we used for the central tendency measures. Here we have a variable with 11 values, and to calculate the range, we simply take the largest value, which is 100, and subtract it from the smallest one, which is 1, and the result is 99. To calculate the interquartile range, we have to first calculate the quartiles, the quartile 1 and quartile 3. Note that there are different ways of calculating the first and the third quartile. What we are doing here, we are using the same way that the NumPy library in Python uses, which is we take the first half, including the median, and then we take the average of both numbers in the middle of this half. So we do this for quartile 1, and we do the same thing for quartile 3, right? And this is why we get Q1 equals to 12.5 and Q3 equals to 17.5. Then the interquartile range is the difference between Q1 and Q3. The second quartile, which is the median, we have already seen its value is 15, which is the value here in the middle. And the semi-interquartile range is the interquartile range divided by 2. And the variance is the sum of the difference between each value of this distribution by its average, and this difference is squared, and the result you divide by the number of objects, minus 1 if you're working with a sample, or divided simply by the number of objects if you are working with a population. And the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. The coefficient of variation is the division between the standard deviation and the average, and the result is given in percentage terms. Just as we did with the central tendency measures, let's make a comparison between the different variability measures. Let's consider now their sensitivity to outliers, their computation, and a few comments about each one of them. As the range takes into account only the extreme values, it's highly sensitive to outliers or to the extreme values. The same holds to variance that takes into account all values, including to calculate the average that's used to determine the dispersion or the spread of the distribution. The same is true for the standard deviation, which is the square root of the variance, and the same is also true for the coefficient of variation that takes into account the average and the standard deviation. The interquartile range and the semi-interquartile range are the only measures that only take into account a few values of the variable in order to be calculated, and the range we know takes into account only the extremes. Whilst the variance, the standard deviation, and the coefficient of variation take into account all the values in the variable to be calculated, the range, the interquartile range, and the semi-interquartile range take into account only some of the values in order to be calculated. In terms of general comments, it's worth saying that IQR and SIQR are very suitable to deal with skewed data because they are not sensitive to outliers or to extreme values. That's what I had to present to you about variability measures. Thank you for watching and see you in our next class.